Hello, friends. Welcome back to GM Philosophy in the Morning. I'm the GM Philosopher. Today, we're talking about spotlight control for game masters and TTRPGs, campaign setting versus one-shot setting. Okay, spotlight control is a very valuable skill for game masters, and the reason this comes up is because I recently published. I'm going to put a card here so you can go watch it if you want. My first ever tabletop audit episode where I basically played in a one-shot and I give verbal commentary during the replaying of that, saying things I would do differently, offering constructive criticism, critique, feedback, etc. So you can see my perspectives and the theories that I usually talk about played out in a real life setting. So I'm basically commentating on a real life game, give you the insights. Now, with that being said, spotlight control is something that came up. Really good comment by Stuart in the Discord said this. Very helpful. Picked up a couple things I will consider in running my game and a few more things that I have solidified that I do not want in my game. I'm not a huge fan of RP. I believe it is needed in longer campaigns, but there was so much in the beginning of this 4-hour one-shot that as the DM and player, I would be like, we are never going to get to the Dragon's Hoard in a few hours unless the DM is going to teleport us due to all the RP in the beginning. Now, this is a fair assessment. There was a lot of RP in the beginning, and this comes down to spotlight control. And I'm going to actually respectfully, I guess you might say disagree, though Stuart didn't really make a statement to disagree with. Stuart said, I'm not a huge fan of RP, but I believe it is needed for longer campaigns. I would say that it's not only needed for longer campaigns, it should be sought after. We should seek to develop it. Why? Because this is how player characters create bigger emotional stakes. If it's just RP for the sake of RP, it might seem, well, it's not really accomplishing any greater emotional resonance. But I would challenge game masters to let that play out over the long term and watch how it develops into meaningful dialogue, into actual meaningful relationships between the characters, not relationships between the players and the players to their fellow player characters, but between the characters themselves. This can become very real relationship material if it is developed and nurtured properly. So I would say that RP is needed. However, we do have this problem with the spotlight control in a one-shot. What if players spend 3 hours in-depth role-playing the greeting scene without leaving any time for the actual adventure? That's exactly what I'm going to cover in this video, the difference between those two and how to conceptualize it and how to run it in your game. Now, that being said, I want to let you know that I have, at this point, 4 open games in my Start Playing games. I run games for players who want to have an immersive role-play, in-depth game that is a sandbox feel, dark, grimdark, gritty, D&D 5e. So if you want to join one of my games, they all start at 1 a.m. CST. I've got games open, I believe it is Tuesday morning at 1 a.m., Wednesday morning, Thursday morning, and I believe I have a Friday morning 1 a.m. game. Yeah, I think so. They are all the Darkest Dawn, grimdark 5e setting, with the exception of one superhero game. My Paragon game is launched, and that's going to be like Marvel meets The Boys, crazy, edgy, grotesque, modern-day superheroes. There's a comet coming toward Earth. They have to stop it, but there's so much more complicated stuff going on. So anyway, those are the games that I have lined up. Please consider clicking on my Start Playing Games link and joining me in these games if you want to actually see the GM Philosopher in real action. If you think to yourself, man, I want to see this guy put his money where his mouth is, this is the way to to actually make that happen. But so far, I have one full game on Start Playing, and it's going brilliant. I've got some brilliant players, and it's going really, really well. So let's dive into this, talking about spotlight control, one-shot versus campaign. Now, the first thing to understand is that you have different goals in a campaign than in a spotlight. And Stuart really pointed this out in his comment. He said, there's so much roleplay in the beginning of this 4-hour one-shot that the DM and player may be like, we're never going to reach the Dragon's Hoard in time because of all this RP, which is true. That's an example of, so that problem, if it were to develop to its full completion, that would be a problem of spotlight control in a one-shot. Basically, man, I had all this stuff planned, I had this adventure planned, but now because more happened in the beginning and it took longer, we're not going to get to the later part of the adventure, right? So we have a pacing problem, but really this is a spotlight problem, and I'm going to tell you why. Stuart also rightfully pointed out that roleplay is needed in longer campaigns, so this is different, right? Now, here's the big difference. An adventure can, and actually is probably made better by, being spaced out over a longer period of time with more in-depth pieces, more in-depth scenes, right? So if you have a Dragon Horde raid and you're planning it into your long-term campaign, like my games on Start Playing, they're planned out for about 100 sessions. So, you think to yourself, if I have 100 sessions, well, what does it matter if it takes 1 session to do the Dragon Horde or 12 sessions? In fact, if it's 12 sessions, we have more time for encounters in the dungeon. We have more time for roleplay between player characters. We could spend almost an entire session role-playing if it comes up, and it won't really hurt the pacing. Well, That's actually not completely true. It can still hurt the pacing, because if pacing feels boring or weird in a session, that's different. But that's also different than spotlight control, right? And what I'm talking about here is spotlight control. What I'm talking about is it's okay for the spotlight to be on these scenes and for the adventure to take longer, as long as the pacing still feels good, right? I got to make a video about pacing versus spotlight control. That's going to be my next video, maybe. But anyway, in a one shot, we only have so much time. So here's what I would propose for this. In a one shot, I think it's really important for the GM to set up scenes and then to basically describe the goal of the scene. So you might say to players when you're just coming into a scene, this is just an example of how I would do it. You don't have to do it this way. There are other ways to do it. But you might say something like, all right, in this scene, you are all going to enter the tavern and introduce yourselves. Now, we want to make this scene relatively fast, right? Because we want to get onto the adventure. So I'm letting all players know I'm going to plan to move on from the scene in about 10 minutes. So take like a minute to introduce your character, maybe a slight bit of role play, and then we're going to start scenes, right? So you can say that coming into the scene. I really believe that setting expectations up this way is important. It lets player characters know kind of like what the scene is supposed to be. And you might think to yourself, well, that's very railroady. Well, there has to be an element of railroading in a one shot if you want to fit the entire adventure, and because the priorities are different. Unless you're playing a sandbox one shot, which is pretty rough. A sandbox one shot wouldn't really probably amount to much that was super interesting or fun. Thus, you kind of need a linear story. And here's the push-pull between sandbox and linear story. A linear story is like a pre-planned story. It's like, here's what we're going to do. You're going to jump into this game, and your goal is going to be to raid the Dragon Horde. See, that's like a linear storyline. And then a complete sandbox game is like, you are dropped into the middle of this setting, and whatever you do is the game. Like, that's the game, right? That's really actually the thing. Now, we can put linear story plot hooks into our sandbox games. If the players opt into them, that's what I call the best version of like a sandbox game. And then there are also games where you can put sandboxy elements into a linear story. There might be segments of the story where you allow the player characters to pretty much cultivate their own existence to whatever extent they wish. But sandboxing always takes more time, right? Whereas a linear story, you're kind of ushered along on this narrative journey. So that's the difference between those two. So when we're playing a one shot, it makes a lot more sense to have a linear story. And with a linear story, we have to control spotlight. We have to control pacing. Okay. So how do we avoid this RP eating up too much time thing? Well, the truth is the game master should be really on top of spotlight movement between different scenes. Okay. And to be really honest, these days, if I were to plan out a one shot, I would plan it in scenes, and I would give myself a set amount of time for each scene. I would honestly probably plan it for either 3 or 4 scenes, and then I would plot out how much time I was going to invest in those scenes, and I would literally share that plan with the players as we enter each scene, right? And I would probably also have like an objective for the scene above table, and I would give them an idea of like how there would be benefits to achieving the objective and drawbacks if they do not, right? So this, now you might say, well, Jim, this is very much railroading, and you're right, but that's kind of what you have to do if you really want to run a cohesive one shot that has some kind of linear storyline. Once again, this is completely different from how I run my long-term campaigns. I really love sandboxiness. I love putting those plot hooks in there, and if players bite into them, it might take them 1 level to complete that arc, or that might become 20 levels worth of gameplay. I don't really know, because I don't know how much time they're going to spend on it. And that's part of the magic of sandbox, which I think is awesome. But anyway, I digress. That's how I would solve the problem of too much roleplay eating up too much spotlight time in your one shot. See, with a one shot, you can plan, but remember that the player characters don't know your plan. They don't know if you have specific scenes set up. They don't know how many scenes are supposed to be in the thing, right? Now, if you were all writing a book together, you would probably share the outline of the book with the other authors, and then you would all kind of work on that. If you were creating a book that had a kind of an outlined adventure, like linear adventure narrative. And I don't think that we should treat one shots much differently. And that's what I would do. I would probably share an outline with my player characters at the onset of what that story would kind of look like. And my whole goal would be to work together with them to tell a narrative story that is engaging in a narrative sense. It's not just fun to play through, though it should be fun to play through, but it should also be a well put together story with a good beginning, a good like complication and conflict, and then a really great climax, and then a good payoff at the end. And when I say payoff, I mean emotional payoff, right? Because that's what we want to do. So that's the difference. That's kind of what I would do. Drop your comments. Let me know what you would do. The goal of this channel is to empower game masters to run better games, and I hope that this has given you a little bit of insight into this. Great comment from Stuart. I really appreciate hearing from everyone. So drop your comment. Let me know what you think. Hit that thumbs up button. Hit that subscribe button. I'll see you awesome people on the next one.